Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Matt Storrs, and welcome to Mattsplaining. On today's episode, I have somebody to talk about one of my favorite genres of music. Expert, please introduce yourself and tell us what you're an expert in.
Hey everyone, this is Tina, and my interest and my expertise, I believe, is in punk rock. You kind of tend to know a lot about what you love, right?
Hmm.
So I'm actually very involved with the local band scene, a lot of like punk rock mostly. And this is the older crowd. So like the veterans are kind of there since the beginning. There's punk rock bands, high school students that are having punk rock bands,
Hmm.
20 in their 20s and their 30s. Now I'm in the older crowd. We
I
all
see.
got day jobs, and then we just play kind of the dive bars on the weekends and just do it to like keep it alive and it's alive and thriving here in Phoenix
Absolutely.
and everywhere.
That's excellent. My understanding of punk rock, to your point about being in the older crowd, is that the birth of punk rock is quite a while ago, especially by today's standards. There's a lot of people try to think of like their Mount Rushmore or like their three heads. Obviously, Mount Rushmore has four heads, but in punk rock, I think that most people think of the three-headed monster of the punk rock origins. And I think those are the first names of those are Hildegard, Wolfgang, and Ludwig, obviously the classical composers. Hildegard, obviously, being a woman doing more chanting, punk rock, very famous for the screaming and chanting within the music. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart just completely changes the game in terms of the music that is being produced, how it's being produced, the chord progression, and just being able to master instruments without necessarily fully understanding them musically as opposed to necessarily being a full expert in those instruments, if that makes sense.
It isn't Amadeus in Clockwork Orange.
I believe there is a fair amount of Ludwig von Beethoven and Mozart in Clockwork Orange. I believe because I know he has the line about drinking his hallucinogenic milk and then listening to Ludwig von Beethoven. So I think that also helps with the argument with Ludwig as well of the fact of like, oh, in some of the depictions in our society, this music has been used to demonstrate kind of like a punk rock mentality, a breaking of mores and social cues, and really did a lot to help sell cod pieces as well. And if anything, also with Mr. Beethoven, the movie Sound of Metal demonstrates that there's nothing more punk rock than going deaf or going through some degree of major challenge and still wanting to play the music, still wanting to compose, still wanting to go out there every night. You have the punk rock mentality of we destroyed a whole hotel room, we got super drunk, we had all the quaaludes. Well, we got another show, so let's go and let's do some damage, so to speak. And I think what unites all punk rock in its current iterations of today, and then in the 70s resurgence as well, is kind of like the ideas of discord, social isolation, and frustration, and anger without a target is ultimately this pent up rage and frustration. And how can we do that? And I think that with a lot of people don't know this, but going back to Hildegard and Mozart and everything like that, there was a considerable number of times, not by today's standards, were they really rambunctious or destructive. But at the time, there's a number of times when there were a couple of instruments that were kind of destroyed. There was some nicks and scratches, and it was a big to do because they were like, hey, I have my conducting baton and I'm going to hit this violin. I'm going to hit this bassoon. And Mozart, I believe, destroyed quite a number of bassoons. That's part of the reason why the bassoon hasn't been as popular, that and the kind of the deepness of the bassoon. I think that's been a big shame. There's been a big uptick in the bassoon in punk rock, actually, in kind of the modern day, using those classical instruments, bringing them into the modern day, saying, hey, we're going to use these things that you think are just for the opera, these are just for the symphony, and you're going to bring them into songs that are 2, maybe 3 minutes long, that have some some anger, to have a hook, that have just this exuberance of emotion coming out of it. Now, based on what you've heard so far, about how much of that would you say was accurate?
I actually would agree with that. And I'm really glad that you brought that up because I wasn't thinking about how the classical music actually, they were like revolutionary punk rockers. That's true. And I'm actually going to have to add up more and add some Mozart to my punk Spotify channel. I appreciate you bringing that up. And it just makes me think even further back to like Adam and Eve. They were, if you think about it, they were the first punk rockers, even if didn't really exist outside of like a book that was written. But yeah, I think they defied God. And they're like, no, we're going to wear clothes. No, we're going to eat these apples. We're going to talk to the snake. You can't tell us what to do.
Yeah, you've isolated us completely. We're gonna get out of this garden. We're gonna cause some havoc for millennia. I think that there's a strong argument, just that mentality of revolt and challenging authority.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I never thought of that before. They paved the way, even if they're just a story in the Bible.
When did you first get into punk rock music?
Well, when I was trying to escape my mother's religion,
I see.
I was 16 and I started spooking. So they like kicked me out of the Jehovah's Witness, kicked me out.
Okay.
So I'm at the smokers wall and I meet all the punk rockers. And at that time I was listening to the Smiths and Depeche Mode and New Order, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper. And when I met them, I started hearing my first like JFA and Social Distortion and 7 Seconds and my favorite Fear. And it just like was love at first note. And I was just in it. It just gave me a platform for all my angst and my rebellion. And it made me feel like I'm not alone and I have all these people in this community.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, punk rock, like just the connection of music really brings people together in a lot of ways. And like finding somebody where it's like, oh, you also listen to this music? That's amazing. It immediately forms a bond.
It really does. Even I mean, at this age, I'm 50, and a lot of the people in my scene are even older. They're 60s, 70s. We have some that are in their 40s, but we're like older crowd. And so I think that's even far in between when you meet people that are like into the same music as you are. And music really is the thing that sets the tone for like, oh yeah, hey, you're my clan, you're in my brood.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's this whole sort of dynamic. There's this idea that I've kind of encountered of, if people have that similar taste, your willingness to overlook some of their scruples and some of their negative, you become a little bit more lenient to like, I don't really like that guy as much like personally, but he does like the Smiths, but he can hang around. I'm not going to hang out with him outside of this. I'm not going to go to the water park with him, but if he's at the show, I'll have polite conversation with him, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And also being in punk, like you can like punk music, but I also like funk.
Right.
I love funk. And I love pop songs like Madonna and what's her name? Oh no, I probably shouldn't talk about that. People will go boo. But
it's okay. You can
I love
be
classical.
who you want to be. Yeah.
I love big band. And it doesn't matter because they're like you're easily accepted.
Absolutely. With regard to punk's origins, what's your interpretation of how punk rock kind of got started, like in the kind of the modern iterations of it?
Well, it originated out of punk. Actually, it was these 60s garage bands.
I see.
Were called punk. But they just like were getting together, jamming. They weren't exactly talented musicians. They just did their thing in a garage. And then in the mid 70s, there was out of Detroit, the Stooges and MC5. And they came out. And then New York, we had the Ramones and Blondie, Talking Heads, New York Dolls, Television. So we had those coming out. And it was out of all this unrest in the economic unrest and unemployment was at an all-time high, and these kids didn't know what to do with themselves, and they were angry and they were bored, and they came out in this music that they started playing. It was playing in dive bars, and then in London, the major cities in UK, it was
Hmm.
happening too, social unrest. And so these kids, had all these strong political opinions, and just there's just nothing. So we're just gonna get drunk and smoke and play music, even though we don't know how. And then they just acquired it as they actually formed their talent as they went along. And
Hmm.
now there is such beautiful songwriting in punk songs. It's like even Sex Pistols has some beautifully written songs, even though they didn't know what the F they were doing. And then
Right.
it became a fashion, and it just spread throughout the world. And it's just been going on ever since. I mean, even here in Phoenix,
Hmm.
there was in like 70 since 76, there's been a punk rock scene.
Oh, wow.
And there it started with JFA,
Hmm.
who came out of here. Then there was Muddy Sphincter, City Girls. And that was all in the like mid 70s or late 70s.
Hmm.
And JFA and Muddy Sphincter still play to
That's
this day.
That's great. How did you feel about like the kind of socialization of pop music that kind of started in the late 90s, early 2000s? How did the Phoenix scene kind of adapt to that, or how did you experience that kind of transition?
Well, cause grunge
Okay.
came out. And in Tempe, we had our little grunge scene with the Gym Blossoms, who I just saw
Hmm.
play 2 weeks ago.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And Refreshments. That's not my favorite. I like
Hmm.
more Nirvana, Soundgarden, grunge.
Right.
But I'm really proud. I'm so proud of that 90s, early 2000 grunge stuff that came out
Hmm.
of here, our hometown. Grunge came out from punk rock.
Absolutely. So it kind of splintered out from punk rock of like to create its own genre, so to speak.
It did.
Very cool. How did you react when stuff started getting a little bit more commercialized? I know like the punk aesthetic started getting sold to people. Did that create any like frustration or concern when you started seeing people that you weren't seeing at shows kind of adopt buying the t-shirts and not knowing who the band was and stuff like that?
Ooh. Actually, I kind of in the 90s, I
Hmm.
kind of took a break. I mean, for punk being my main music source and sort of became a raver,
Hmm.
I moved to London and I
Okay.
was just like going to raves. So I kind of wasn't around for that.
I
I
see.
mean, I would, and then when I came back, Phoenix, I would go see bands like the Pixies or the White Stripes, bands like that. And I've never been one to buy a T-shirt, but I never judge anyone who does.
Okay, so that's good at least. Yeah, I mean, I've talked to people that like try to kind of gatekeep enjoyment, and it's always refreshing to hear people be like, "Oh no, if people enjoy it, they enjoy it, and don't buy the t-shirt. You want to wear the t-shirt, you can go ahead." And that's always refreshing to hear. This has been very informing. If people wanted to learn more about you or wanted to learn more about punk rock, where would you recommend that they look?
Oh, okay. Well, if you have Spotify, I started a channel and called Punk Rock Spectrum. So that's all
Okay.
you have to type in, and that's my playlist. And it's about 3 hours long, and it's songs that inspired punk rock to songs and bands that punk rock inspired. And I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna add some classicals, Mozart.
Oh, I love that. That's
That
great.
is absolutely. And who did you say? Hildegard?
Hildegard van Bingen, I believe, or Bingen.
Oh, I'll have to listen to that because I haven't heard it before. I've
Hmm.
heard of the name, but yeah, so I might have to add some of that too. So there's a lot of reggae too on there because reggae inspired the UK sound,
I see.
beginning UK sound. So also, if you want to go on my band page on
Hmm.
Facebook, it's called "What Band Are You Listening to?"
Hmm.
And that's where I promote all the upcoming shows.
Fantastic. Tina, this has been so informative and such a delight. I really appreciate you talking to me today.
Oh, I appreciate talking to you too.
Excellent. My name is Matt Storrs, and this has been Mattsplaining.